What's up, guys? Lee the editor here. So, we've had some good success with recent videos, and I have a lot of free time on my hands right now just because it's January. I work retail, and so they're trying to cut back the hours after the big rush at Christmas. So, I am only working like 20 hours a week right now. I still have a couple weeks before I have to go back to school. So, I thought I'd add in this video series I've been thinking of doing in addition to the regular match, gameplay, etc. card game videos that we do on the channel. So this is going to be me putting on my card game professor hat that I like wearing so much, and just talking about some basic card concepts. I have been playing card games since I was in elementary school when I first got introduced to the Pokemon TCG. I've played a number of card games competitively, including Vanguard, Yu-Gi-Oh!, Shadowverse, and a little bit of Hearthstone. I don't have very much Magic experience, so some of you are going to reject these comments based on that, and if you do, very well. But I'm going to try and make my observations as general as possible so they can apply to not only the games I've played, but just about any game out there. So, I have read books on game design. It's a thing I like studying in my own free time, so I'm hoping you all will enjoy talking about it with me, essentially. My inspiration kind of to do this came from The History of Video Games, which was a book I read recently, where the author remarks that it speaks to the youth of the video game industry, that they don't even have standardized terms for white box / gray box / black box builds, which is the basic build of a game without any art assets on it. And just about every video game has to go through that, but there's no standardized industry term. Some people call it a black box, some people call it a white box, some people call it a gray box. I find we're in a very similar situation in card games, where there's a lot of terms that get passed around the community that are very integral to playing card games that a lot of people misuse, don't understand, or simply haven't heard. So I thought it'd be a good idea to make a video series like this, and that way, if I'm ever having the conversation, or any of you watching are ever having the conversation, and we need something to point to be like, this is what that term means. Granted, I cannot be the be-all, end-all definer of every term, but I'm going to do my best to lay out the terms as I understand them, and hopefully it can add to your appreciation of games in general. It can add to both my and your skill just thinking about these concepts more regularly, and hopefully we have some fun along the way. So this first video is going to be a little bit shorter. It's just going to talk about my basic theory of gameplay. What I mean by that is that when you're playing a game, you always have a limited number of actions at any given point in time. When they were trying to define skill at chess and get chess ranking systems, which we have in place now, they wanted to try and find a way to establish who always made the move that brought them closer to victory. But that was impossible, because it could be argued in a number of different directions. So they ended up deciding that the only metric you could go by was wins and losses. And so this has sort of become the standard for every board game, every tabletop game, every card game, and most video games. If you've ever been laddering on a game and just lost and gone down and won and gone up, then you know what I'm talking about. I want to talk about the individual action points, though, because they may be impossible to perfectly quantify, but I believe we can subdivide them. My basic theory is that action in any game comes down to three major groups that any action can be defined by. The first is aggressiveness, aggro for short. The second is control, and many of you Magic players out there will be expecting a third thing, because the standard Magic paradigm for deck archetypes is that there is aggro, control, and combo. But as much as you can combine cards in most card games that exist, I would argue that it is not a category of action point, that you are talking about something that drives towards an end result of aggro or control. The idea is you can never win a game simply by combining enough cards. A combo deck will usually either be combo aggro and use its combos to produce the most damage, combo control, and be using its combos to take the board, essentially, and not allow the opponent to play. A number of other different subcategories that you can combo into. So combo is an important concept to understand, but it's a topic for a future video and not this video. The third basic action concept, in my opinion, is tempo. In this video, I'm going to be going over each of those three concepts, giving a brief definition, and in the upcoming series of videos, we'll go more in depth into each one. And then after that, if it seems like you guys are liking the videos, if it seems like they're easy enough to produce, things like that, I would be more than happy to look at any number of other concepts. In terms of the three basic action concepts, the first is aggro. That's the easiest to understand. It's how directly you pursue the win con of the game. That's your flood decks, your rush decks, your build a big dude that hits really hard decks. Any gameplay action that advances you directly towards the win con of the game is considered aggro. Now, it is interesting how this applies to things like, say, Exodia, because most people don't like to consider draw power an aggro action, but it is in that deck. It's very valuable to understanding different win cons and the value of aggressive moves, because the important part about understanding all of these, one of the important parts about understanding all of these, is knowing when an action is correct. So, in terms of a draw card, in most games, you're looking at what is the value of that draw. In a deck like Exodia, you're looking at, okay, this brings me closer to my win con, which is Exodia. In that case, you reevaluate the value of those draw cards, not as control or tempo cards, but as aggro cards. And generally, the reason that aggro is the easiest to understand is that 90% of moves in aggro decks are correct. You essentially just want to do the thing your deck is built to do, and proceed directly towards the game state that is winning. There will be more on aggro's individual video, but for now, it's time to move on to control. Control is sort of in the middle of the easiness to understand of these concepts, and it happens to be my favorite. I love control. I'm a natural control player, and I find it to be the most rewarding of the basic concepts. What control is, on a basic level, it is what influence you have exerted over the game state. And obviously, at this point, you're going to start to see that there are some obvious overlaps between the concepts, because you can exert control over the game state in such a way as to produce a result closer to the win con. Now, I know that was a lot of jargon I just threw at you, but the basic concept is if you wipe out a board in order to make an attack on your opponent, in something like Yu-Gi-Oh! You play your Raigeki and then you attack face. That is both a control and aggro move. It's important to understand that, yes, these concepts do work in tandem a lot, but they do all have their own values and their own reason to be evaluated. Control often is understood as decks that retire, send things to the graveyard, send them to the drop zone, whatever, the discard pile, essentially. And that is usually one of the easiest forms of control to build into a game. So you will often find a deck like that. That is a perfectly good example of control. But there are additional types of control, such as controlling the actions your opponent can take through things like either restrictions on their actions via cards having special rules, or discard to reduce the number of cards they have available to play. Control can be a very nebulous concept, just because the idea of having some element of control over the game state exists at all points. Because, like I said, these are the most general concepts. You can subdivide them into specific different groups. With that said, I'd like to move on to tempo. Now, tempo is one of the least generally understood general concepts for gaming. Tempo, I believe, originates as a chess term, and in chess it means the number of pieces that you have brought out onto the board proper from your beginning zone. So if you have, your knight, your rook, and your bishop all out in the middle of the field, you've got 3 pieces deployed, versus if your opponent has most of their pieces still in their back row, they have less access to them. What that generally means for card games, and I see a lot of people confusing it with the speed at which you play, but what it really means when you drill down to it is essentially the value you get out of your cards. So, in a perfect world, every card is worth 1 card, but we as players attempt to move that value to something more in our favor. Again, when you look at the crossover with control and aggro, if we go back to that scenario where we played that Raigeki, or we drew cards for Exodia, obviously those cards were producing more cards than they were, so that increases their tempo as well. This is why tempo tends to be one of the easiest to ignore, because you're always getting some degree of tempo, and you don't often have to focus on it unless you have specifically built a deck around being a tempo deck, around getting the absolute most value and reducing the value your opponent gets. This tends to happen via different combinations, or things like bouncing cards, or I suppose you could also say locking cards, but that's a whole nother issue, because it also involves a lot of control. But again, a lot of these concepts tend to cross over. The interesting thing to apply to tempo is bouncing cards. When you look at bouncing cards, the act of bouncing a card is returning a card to its owner's hand. And most people, when they first start card games, tend to look at effects like that and say, well, that effect isn't any good. It doesn't really change the game state. They still own that card. I haven't subtracted from their card possession. I just essentially pushed that unit back 1 turn. But that is the important thing to understand. You've pushed that unit back 1 turn. So when you talk about the overall value of a turn, and in most card games, the resources that you have to apply to put a unit on board, then you start to see the value of bouncing something. And so, a lot of tempo decks thrive by making the opponent waste resources, making them use things again, and trying to get the maximum value out of their turn, so that eventually it slides into a game state where you have more things deployed, you have more possession, things like that, where your opponent just isn't going to be able to come back. The interesting thing about my general theory is that I developed it with these three categories specifically because you often see a tendency in games for things to naturally counter each other. When developing these three categories, you could say, okay, why just the three? These are the most general, but you could be talking about combo, mid-range, defensive, etc., etc. Stall's a big one as well. You could be talking about all of these additional concepts which don't fit perfectly into one of the three categories. I tend to define them as existing between different categories. So mid-range is part control, part aggro, etc. I could be talking about all those, but I believe these to be the most general, and why I believe them to be the most general is partly because when you look at how things tend to naturally counter each other, these three have a bit of a rock, paper, scissors dynamic. I find when you drill down to the basics in most games, you tend to get to that three-way state where one thing counters another, counters the first. It's sort of the most basic way to check games, to make sure that meta doesn't just become about the one thing. The way I tend to see it is that control tends to naturally counter aggro. Once you can take control of the game state and stop them from being able to pursue their win con, then you essentially shut down what that deck wants to do. Tempo tends to beat control because even if you're controlling their cards, if they can get more value out of the cards, it does eventually lead to that game state where you cannot come back. So no matter how much control you have over the game state, if the deck is built to produce a game state that you have no counter for, it'll probably win that engagement. And aggro tends to be tempo because you can't outvalue being dead. It's that simple. Tempo tends to think more long-term, aggro tends to think more immediate. So the fact that aggro is killing you on turn 2, 3, whatever, and tempo doesn't really have any response to that until later in the game, means that aggro tends to win those engagements. As for other individual deck concepts, like I mentioned before, stall, defensive, mid-range, etc., those will probably get their own videos at some point if we continue this series long term. For the moment, I am planning in-depth videos on each of the three major concepts I just mentioned. I hope y'all enjoyed this video. I hope to be able to continue this series, and, hope you have a good day. I never know how to end these things because I don't like doing the whole like, comment, subscribe daily. I mean, if you want to, we welcome it. Thank you very much. Your lucky number of the day is 22. Bye-bye!